Good morning. I'm Meredith Richards. I'm president of the Virginia Rail Policy Institute. Welcome to our webinar. Thank you for your interest in rail policy. And for those of you out west, very good morning. And that is good early morning. So this webinar is about lessons learned from Florida's experience purchasing rail lines for public benefits. Few rail policy ideas inspire as much enthusiasm among American rail advocates as the public ownership of passenger rail corridors. What else, they ask, enables Europe and Japan and other countries to run those fast, frequent, punctual trains than their model of national ownership of the passenger corridors? In contrast, America's witnessed a half century of freight railroads hosting passenger trains that often results in slow trains, poor on-time performance, and infrequent service. And the result is that the American public has not adopted passenger rail as at anything like the level of those other countries. Now, there are people who hold the opposite view that passenger rail should be privately owned and government should get out of the business of subsidizing and operating passenger rail. But in my own 25 years of rail advocacy, I have never met anyone who believes that our system of publicly funded passenger trains on privately owned freight corridors is an ideal to aspire to. The speakers we'll hear today are changing the paradigm. As a team at Florida DOT, they successfully developed Tri-Rail and SunRail commuter services on public infrastructure in collaboration with the freight railroads. And there is much to learn from them, especially for those of us in Virginia, which is investing billions of dollars over the next decade in acquiring right-of-way, track, and passenger rights from the freight railroads and building out a public infrastructure of dedicated lines for Virginia regionals, Amtrak long-distance trains, and Southeast high-speed rail. So we have much to learn from Florida's successes and those of other states. And to our speakers, welcome. Thank you for your willingness to share your experience with us on acquiring and operating rail lines for public benefits. And now I'm turning this over to Michael Testerman, VRPI's Executive Director, who will introduce our speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. The folks in Florida have been really busy lately, and you may have been reading about them in the trade press. They're working closely to get the Bright Line extended over to Orlando and perhaps a little bit beyond that. And leading up that team is Brad Thoburn. He's the Assistant Secretary for Strategic Development at the Florida Department of Transportation. He was born in Ohio and got his college degree at Washington and Lee here in Virginia, but he's mostly spent his time in Florida. And he started, well, he's previously been with Michael Baker International, and then has also worked with the Jacksonville Transportation Authority. And he led a lot of innovative things that happened there. And now as Chief Planner for Florida DOT, and he's also worked in that capacity. And right now he's leading a major transit system overhaul with the, he previously has done that, and he has experience in developing strategic plans and transportation policy. So he's just well qualified to be leading this effort. Fred Wise, who's going to be helping us out on the presentation, is a senior project manager and policy advisor with HNTB, but he has 29 years of experience with Florida Department of Transportation, where he held an executive director position in charge of the Florida Rail Enterprise, and we'll be hearing about that in our program. He's worked collaboratively to develop public-private partnerships between rail industry in the state. And he's played a key role in addressing mobility demands through the planning and development of rail passenger services, including both intercity and commuter rail. And he negotiated agreements for rail corridor acquisitions, agreements related to the shared use of rail corridors for freight and passenger operations. And those negotiations included safety, liability, infrastructure, capacity, operations, and compensation issues. So he has a wide range of experience and now has about 40 years of experience to lend to the project before us. Charles M. Heffinger is known as Mike, is Chief Operations Officer at SunRail, and that's within the Florida Department of Transportation District 5. He started out his career almost 30 years ago as a professional engineer trainee at Florida DOT. And he currently oversees all of the activities for SunRail in District 5. George Gault has been helping out with this team. He currently serves as consultant program manager for the SunRail project and has been supporting the Central Florida Rail Corridor and SunRail. He helped establish the National Environmental Policy and Federal Transit Administration and Federal Railroad Administration evaluation processes, which led to a finding of no significant impact for the 61-mile corridor that SunRail is using right now. So that led to successfully completing the New Starts and Small Starts program under MAP 21 and 2 Federal Transit Administration and FFGA applications. So he's also got extensive qualifications to be helping out with this project. With that, I'm going to turn everything over to Brad, and he can take us through our information, our slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate it. And we do, we really appreciate, can you hear me all right? I just want to make sure I'm coming through.
Yep.
Good, okay. We really do appreciate the opportunity to have really, we're presenting, but this is, I think, partly just a conversation that we're starting as we think about the future of passenger rail and the opportunities that are out there. We do have some good stories to tell about our past efforts, and we'll share those today. But with all that said, we're probably very similar to a lot of other places like Virginia that are still trying to figure out what the right vision and role is for the state as it relates to intercity and commuter rail or other rail options. So Tri-Rail and SunRail are, I think, good case studies, offer some lessons learned, but I think as much as anything today is a good opportunity to kind of start the dialogue, because obviously Virginia is doing some things and taking a very proactive look at how they can advance passenger rail. And so we are internally are actually starting a work group that's kind of taking a second look at, what the structure is here, the role of Florida Rail Enterprise, and the role of our districts versus central office. Because even though I think you'll look and you'll see we've got some great case studies, we're like a lot of other places. It's a little bit of fits and starts with a policy really driven by projects and maybe not a grand vision for passenger rail and state. And so we're asking some of the same questions you are. And so look forward to continuing to have this being part of an ongoing dialogue. Michael mentioned we are also working with Brightline, which is kind of a little different tack than owning and operating the rail. But again, it'll offer some lessons learned for everybody to see what works and what doesn't. And so as we move forward, that's something that we'll share with you. I'm gonna turn it over because, you know, between Fred and George and Mike, or we call him Hef actually, um, they've got just a wealth of knowledge to share, and I don't want to take up too much time because, given the importance of this conversation, I want to make sure you had access to some of the key folks that can really offer insights into the questions you're asking. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Fred, and Fred's going to give you some of that background of how we got where we did in the tri-rail side. And I think we're going to go Fred, George, then Mike.
Okay, thank you, Brad. It's certainly a pleasure to be with you all this morning to talk a little bit about the South Florida Rail Corridor acquisition between Miami and West Palm Beach over 30 years ago, and the development of Tri-Rail. And then,
hey, Fred, can you hold a second? I
Sure.
thought we were going to have a PowerPoint up. Is that? Can people see that? There you go.
Yeah,
Okay.
there it is. Yeah, I knew it was coming. I was trying to stall till I started seeing slides. But yeah, again, it is a pleasure to be with you this morning to talk about the South Florida experience, as well as Central Florida and the development of SunRail more recently. Next slide, please. Let's go on to the next slide. So congestion on I-95 in South Florida between West Palm Beach and Miami has been a challenge for decades. And in 1983, the department engaged local governments in conducting a study of alternatives to provide additional capacity in some form, especially given the multi-year major reconstruction that was going to take place on I-95. So there was consideration of bus as well as rail options. The Florida East Coast Railway was evaluated, and of course, FEC at that time had no interest whatsoever in shared use arrangement with a public entity for any kind of passenger service. So the rail focus shifted to the CSX corridor, and then also looked at a combination of bus, rail, and then ultimately the department and local government partners decided that commuter rail on the CSX corridor was the preferred alternative. Next slide. So from a governance perspective, to begin with, the department worked closely with the MPOs, and then the local governance evolved over the years. There was an interagency agreement among the three counties, Miami-Dade, Broward, and Palm Beach, that included two elected representatives of each of the three counties. And then it continued to evolve in terms of expanded membership and additional authority until it became the South Florida Regional Transportation Authority that we have today, providing oversight over the Tri-Rail project. And the SFRTA includes a 9-member board, 2 elected commissioners from each of the three counties, along with 2 gubernatorial appointees, and then the Florida DOT district secretary down in Fort Lauderdale is also a member. And actually, he was just elected chairman of SFRTA. Next slide, please. To begin with, the department negotiated an access and service agreement with CSX. And under this agreement, it assumed that Amtrak would be the operator of the commuter rail service. CSX would dispatch and maintain the corridor, and the state would establish commuter rail policies, and then schedules would be developed between CSX, Amtrak, and Florida DOT. There were a lot of disadvantages to this arrangement. There was limited control, there was limited flexibility, and perhaps most troubling was the fact that Amtrak would even have priority over commuter traffic based on their agreement with CSX. Next slide. So in the 80s, in 1980, there was a Staggers Rail Act and deregulation of the railroad industry, which caused major Class I railroads around the country to rationalize their system, and through a process of abandonment, short line conversion, mergers, acquisitions, there was a lot of change, a lot of instability. Ultimately, it proved to be a real positive in terms of the nation's rail system. But CSX announced the potential sale of a couple hundred miles between Sebring and Miami. And so that obviously includes the West Palm Beach, Miami corridor. The department engaged in an evaluation of potential public benefits associated with acquisition of the Miami to West Palm piece. And this was an interdisciplinary team, including engineers, planners, and policymakers, economists, and others within the department. And ultimately, the decision was made to pursue acquisition, and it was based on a number of benefits, and I'll just mention a few of them. One was that due to the high density commercial and residential development just to the east of I-95, and then CSX to the west on the border of the I-95 corridor, real estate prices were extremely high for capacity expansion on the interstate. And it was determined that that public ownership would provide the permanent ability to develop commuter rail and make that a part of South Florida's transportation infrastructure. Additionally, the department, even at that time, had interest in high-speed rail and was actively involved in plans for development of high-speed rail. And it was thought that that by owning this corridor, it would facilitate developing high-speed rail and through the Miami to West Palm area. Additionally, it was determined that public investment in whether it be in grade separations or other public projects would be facilitated by ownership. There was some concern about potential sale of the line to a short line operator and potential delays to the interest the state had in developing commuter rail in the corridor. It was also an intact, assembled corridor that provided connectivity between the three major airports in South Florida, Palm Beach, Fort Lauderdale, and Miami. And so for those reasons and others, the department decided to enter negotiations with CSX and acquiring the corridor. Next slide. In 1988, the department concluded the negotiations with CSX and purchased the 81-mile corridor for $264 million. The CSX retained the exclusive perpetual freight easement, so they continued to be the common carrier and serving their freight customers. Next slide. And under the operating and management agreement that was negotiated, CSX paid a per car charge as well as a monthly fee for use of the corridor. The users shared the maintenance expense based on proportional use, and capital improvements were made by mutual consent, and operating windows were defined. And primarily the commuter traffic was going to be mornings and afternoons and early evenings. The agreement consisted of two phases. Phase A, under which CSX would dispatch and maintain the corridor, and a phase B. And under the phase B, the state would dispatch and maintain the corridor. The state envisioned the possibility of future responsibility for dispatch and maintenance, but was not prepared to assume that responsibility on the front end. So CSX served as the state's agent in dispatching and maintaining the corridor. Either party could trigger a change in that arrangement and basically flip it. But the party that made the request with advance notice 9 months would be responsible for paying the labor costs associated with any displaced CSX employees. The Tri-Rail service actually commenced in January of 1989, and it was not a pretty picture, to be blunt about it. I mean, the ridership was much less than anticipated, and it was for a variety of reasons. And I think principally among those reasons is the fact that it's a single track. It was at that time it was a single track railroad. And so there was insufficient capacity because you had 4 Amtrak trains a day, as well as the commuter traffic and CSX freight traffic. And you had an antiquated signal system that relied primarily on above ground wiring. And of course, in South Florida, thunderstorms were still are frequent and could be a major disruption in terms of the signal system of the railroad. Additionally, Tri-Rail was unsuccessful in having an effective feeder distributor bus system. There was limited parking at stations. And so for all those reasons, and then of course, CSX being responsible for dispatch and maintenance, and they were less than flexible when it came to maintenance activity and in terms of regard for the commuter operation. And then it was a real challenge for them to overcome a history of dispatching traffic the way they traditionally dispatched it. So didn't always honor the agreement in terms of giving commuter trains priority. So there were a lot of problems that plagued the commencement of the service. Next slide, please. In 2007, the department had the opportunity to renegotiate the operating and management agreement. And this was based on the department leveraging the Central Florida Rail Corridor acquisition and development of SunRail. So this was linked to the Central Florida transaction. CSX agreed to support the department in taking over dispatch and maintenance, and without paying the labor costs, which previously were made it prohibitively expensive to take over dispatch and maintenance. The agreement also included more favorable operating windows. There were changes to maintenance and construction standards that were beneficial. And the compensation actually improved to the South Florida operation. So SFRTA assumed responsibility for dispatch and maintenance in 2015 under these arrangements. And prior to assuming responsibility for dispatch and maintenance, on-time performance was about 81.4%. And today it's averages about 90%. So it's significant improvement. Now it had improved from a lot less than 81.4% back when the service first started and plagued by all those problems that I described. But through a full funding grant agreement and double tracking and through modernization of the signal system, even with CSX dispatching and maintaining, the on-time performance did improve quite a bit. But it's better today than it was prior to SFRTA assuming responsibility for dispatch and maintenance. Next slide. Pre-pandemic, SFRTA or Tri-Rail operated 50 trains a day and averaged over 15,000 passengers a day. Next slide. Next slide. Yeah, obviously we're moving on to Central Florida, and in 2004, the department, in partnership with Central Florida local governmental entities that are part of the SunRail project, had already determined that the commuter rail and the CSX corridor was the preferred alternative in terms of addressing mobility demand in Central Florida. CSX approached the department's leadership. So the department's executive team heard CSX's presentation of their strategic plan, which called for passenger service primarily on the A line between Jacksonville and Orlando and on to the south. They would obviously continue serving their freight customers in the corridor, including Orlando, but they would shift through freight traffic over to the S line, which is more in the central part of the state, down through Ocala to their planned intermodal logistics center, which ultimately was built in Winter Haven. Of course, on the A line, CSX was already accommodating 6 Amtrak trains a day with the Silver Meteor and Star between New York and Miami, and then the auto train between Lorton, Virginia and Sanford. So this was their plan, and it's something that's really facilitated the development of the Central Florida Rail Corridor and SunRail. Next slide. So negotiations took place in 2005 and 6, and then August the 2nd of 2006, the department and CSX rolled out an agreement in principle. And actually, there was a lot of fanfare associated with that. Governor Bush and former CSX CEO Michael Ward and congressional delegation and other Florida officials met in Orlando to celebrate the agreement in principle. The agreement reflected the Tri-Rail lessons learned. So the agreement called for Central Florida to be responsible for dispatch and maintenance on day one. Additionally, the Central Florida transaction involved a lot less real estate than the South Florida transaction. We found in South Florida that we were managing a lot of property that weren't crucial to the commuter rail operation. So in Central Florida, we only purchased the property we needed to support the commuter rail operation and other public projects. The department was not responsible for labor protection or the impact on CSX's employees in this transaction. And additionally, the agreement in principle in Central Florida included the commitment on the part of CSX to support DOT in assuming responsibility for dispatch and maintenance in South Florida without paying those labor costs. And so that was a real positive. Of course, the operating windows were defined, and I know George and Health will talk about that in a few minutes in more detail. Next slide, please. So the sale and purchase agreement included some $150 million for the $61.5 million, but the transaction itself was $432 million. Now the $432 million was supported by an appraisal of the property. So it was worth the $432 million. CSX agreed to spend all the $432 million plus an additional $68 million for a total of $500 million in the state of Florida on rail infrastructure improvements. A number of contractual provisions were very specific about how CSX was to spend that money. For example, $198 million was contractually committed to be spent on the S line, where the freight trains were going to be diverted. Some 8 to 9 through freight trains, I think, ultimately were diverted over to the S line. And the department's interest was in making sure there was sufficient capacity so that this was an efficient and safe operation, and so that the impact on the motoring public could be minimized at those crossings. Additionally, there was some $52 million on a 50-50 basis for statewide projects subject to the public benefits warranting the investment on the part of the state. And then, as was the case in South Florida, CSX retained exclusive perpetual freight easement and continued to be the common carrier. Next slide. So our operating management agreement reflected the provisions of the agreement in principle, and DOT controlled dispatch and maintenance from day one. CSX paid the per car mile and as well as a lease fee. And then as indicated, the operating windows were defined. Next slide. So in 2014, the department initiated the initial operating segment, or the first phase of SunRail between DeBerry and Sand Lake Road, which is just south of Orlando. And then in 2018, extended service on down to Poinciana to the south. And then the northern extension is to be determined. Next slide. That's it.
All right, so we're going to move on to George now.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. If you go back, well, I'm going to start with, I'm basically going to provide an overview of the challenges with the transition from CSX doing the O&M on the corridor and FDOT, CFRC taking over the operations and the maintenance, and then take us up to the SunRail startup. So the very beginning of this, the start of this all was really trying to agree on the concept, define the service corridor, and identify the stakeholders who are going to be responsible for this. So the proposed commuter rail service was defined to be between DeLand in the north at DeLand Amtrak station, going through Volusia County, on through Seminole County, Orange County, Osceola County, and finishing down at Poinciana Industrial Park for the 61 miles. So this was all done in cooperation with the City of Orlando, Metroplan, Links, and the 4 counties. And they all, the 4 counties and the City of Orlando ended up being our partners. Next slide, please. So it looks kind of complicated here, but when we say we're buying a 61-mile corridor, we really were focused on the green. We were buying the part we needed to run SunRail, and CSX was going to retain all the freight yards and spur lines, and so they could service their customers. And that means that they're still responsible for maintaining that, all the operations on that once they left the main line. So DOT and CFRC would be responsible for maintaining the green. So when we, as Fred had mentioned, this railroad was primarily a single track railroad with some sidings. And what our project was to add the additional upgrades of track and signals. So this graphic you see here shows the green, that the final version of the green of what we have, and still shows the red that CSX still operates and maintains. And then the black dots along the right side are the 16 stations that we added in phase 1 and phase 2, plus a couple yards. So it's clearly defined what it was doing. So the existing freight and Amtrak service was already there. And we added the SunRail commuter service with those upgrades. That was key to, we couldn't do it without it. We basically had to evaluate all of CSX's freight and Amtrak's requirements and then compare them what the infrastructure had with ours added to it. So we had 4 Amtrak stations in there that they needed to continue to access. And there was several CSX yards and side tracks. Overall, there was 124 grade crossings. So Amtrak had a DeLand Amtrak, a Winter Park Amtrak, an Orlando Amtrak, and the Kissimmee Amtraks. So they were basically almost equally spaced down the corridor. Next slide, please. So SunRail's a partnership, as I mentioned, and between FDOT and the 4 counties in the city of Orlando. So it was really important to try to say, okay, what's the roles and responsibilities? And DOT took on the larger role in negotiations with CSX to acquire the corridor. And then they also agreed, and they basically had the Florida legislature authorize them to buy the corridor and then to operate the corridor and be responsible for the O&M costs for the first 7 years. They also took on the responsibility of being the lead agency dealing with the Federal Transit Agency in order to build all the infrastructure. So the design, the permitting, and the construction of the SunRail commuter system was basically on FDOT. SunRail was funded, though, in partnership with the locals. So it was 25 FDOT, 25 with the locals, and 50 was the FTA federal funding. So the total cost of phase 1 and what I call phase 2 south was $567 million. We still have 12 miles between DeLand and DeBerry that has to be added and will be in the near future. So the way it was set up was the other stakeholders, the Central Florida Rail, what we call the Central Florida Commuter Rail Commission, was created. And that was the 4 counties in the city of Orlando. They had their own interlocal governance agreement that allowed them to operate and define what their responsibilities were. And then DOT entered into agreements with the Central Florida Commuter Rail Commission for a funding agreement, an interlocal funding agreement, and an interlocal operating agreement. And then that basically defined the financial responsibilities and the operating constraints that would be DOT's responsibility. And if we wanted to deviate from them, we would comply with the requirements in those agreements to make any changes or to address any unknown or unforeseen conditions. So, and then the next step was to define when transition would happen. So SunRail was to be transitioned to the local partners in the May of 2021. So effective May 1st, 2021, the department was going to convey an easement over the corridor to the Central Florida Rail Commission to allow CFRC to operate the commuter rail system. The corridor would continue to be owned by the department. The department also is required to convey all the commuter rail system assets to the CFCRC at the same time as the easements conveyed, so they can take on the responsibility of operations and maintaining the corridor. And then all the personal property that goes with it, of course, is included in that. And they'll take on the maintenance and the repair and the replacement work. But that's assuming that at the time of the transition, that all the property is being conveyed in a state of good repair, which is generally means that all the necessary maintenance and repair and replacement work has been performed. Next slide, please. So some key decisions we had to make, and Fred introduced those and talked about them. And probably one of the most was making sure we had control of dispatch. And we got that when we bought the corridor. So that was a focus right from the beginning, a lesson learned from Tri-Rail. That was really important for us to follow. And the reason for that is, I mean, quite often a CSX freight is not a scheduled railroad. It shows up when it shows up. So, and they're, 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 foot long trains. So they have a big impact in the corridor if they get on the corridor and they happen to be there when we're running our operation. So there has to be a lot of management of that. So when they show up to the corridor, we have to determine if it's in the appropriate time frame that we can allow them to come into the yards or go to wherever their destination is. And Amtrak, similarly, I mean, they start up way up north or they start in Miami, and quite often they don't arrive on time. So it's real important to be able to manage the dispatch so we can make sure that we provide the best possible service for our customers with all these other activities going on. Next slide, please. So part of the shared ownership is that you have to negotiate and establish good operating windows, ones that make sense. And at the beginning, you know, we had to sit and with CSX and really look at their local operation, not just their road freights or their freights that are coming from elsewhere. And we needed to do what we call a rail simulation of the rail traffic. So we look at the origin destinations compared to what they were running at the time and what we were planning to run and what Amtrak was running to make sure that the infrastructure we added was going to work for everybody. So we added a lot of double track, we upgraded the signal system, and those were the two key things that we needed to do. And that in itself improved the capacity throughout the corridor, and that benefited everyone. So the negotiation for the exclusive passenger windows was for 12 hours a day, and the freight was 5 hours a day, and mixed was 7 hours a day. So we had a peak period, which really is from 5 in the morning till 10 in the morning. That's 5 hours. And then we had an afternoon, which was from peak, which was from 3 p.m. to 10 p.m., about 7 hours. And those made up the 12 hours. And then we had a mixed freight window where 1 or 2 freights could be in the corridor with us between 10 and 3. And during that time period, our headways were 2 hours off peak. And then during our peak periods, it's 30 minutes. So it's important that we had exclusive passenger in our peak periods. And then we had some tolerance for freight in the mixed windows. So CSX remains the common carrier, the designated freight carrier. So they are obligated to reasonably provide service to anyone on the corridor who needs it. So that those freight customers are still there, and they do continue to add and subtract from their needs. And that carload traffic is important to get to those customers in a timely way. So that freight window is primarily from midnight to 5 in the morning. And CSX scheduled their carload deliveries from the yard to those customers in that time period. And most of their through freights come through between that time period as well. There's only 1 or 2 that come during the midday. So that was a critical part of the negotiation. And a key part of that too was the relocation of 8 or 9 CSX freight trains to the S line. So at Amtrak, they have their 4 stations, and they also have an auto train. And that auto train comes from Lorton, Virginia down to Sanford. That brings automobiles and passengers together. And that train drives daily. And then the remaining 4 trains, they're either destined for Miami or for Tampa. And they're return trips each day. Next slide, please. So the biggest challenge in some ways was how to take over responsibility of the railroad services for maintaining freight in Amtrak while we were building it. And as Fred mentioned during the agreement, we got that day 1. So after we closed on the corridor, it was our responsibility prior to our revenue service during construction to take on management of this corridor, maintaining it and dispatching it. So the way we approached it was, since we didn't have a dispatch center, we had to hire CSX to set up a temporary dispatch office. And that worked out exceptionally well. They had a dedicated dispatch staff, and they worked closely with our contractors during construction. So we had what we call curfews, work windows, to accomplish most of the infrastructure upgrades. At the same time, they were looking out for their own interest as much as possible as well, to make sure their freight customers were being served, because they had not relocated to the S line. They were still bringing their freights, their main freights onto the A line to the CFRC corridor. And of course, Amtrak was there as well. So we had to make sure that Amtrak service was not it's significantly delayed or impeded. And then after revenue service, we had the Central Florida Operating and Management Agreement, what we call the acronym CFOMA, and that defined all the responsibilities for maintenance and operations after revenue service. So the key was get the corridor upgraded, maintain traffic. Our O&M contractor, our maintenance contractor, construction contractor, we had several names for him. He not only was building the corridor, he was responsible for doing the day-to-day maintenance as well, making sure we were in compliance with the Federal Railroad Administration requirements and our own requirements. And that worked out again very well. And both the CSX and the contractor had a very respectful relationship, and it worked to the benefit of both of them. So once we got to the revenue service point, CSX, and this was April of 2014, CSX was required to relocate their 9 freight trains to the S line, which they did. And then we commenced our passenger revenue service, respecting our operating windows and respecting the freight operating windows. And that we gave a notice to proceed to an O&M contract, operations and maintaining contractor, who was Bombardier on SunRail. So that procurement was going on during construction, and they were selected probably 4 months prior to the operation to allow them to mobilize. Next slide. So at revenue service, this is what it looked like. We have, right now, we have up to 40 SunRail trains per day. And phase 1, we have 12 stations, and phase 1 was the larger start, 32 miles. And then in 2018, we added the extension down to Point Siena, which was 17 miles and 4 stations. And currently we are now talking about the phase 2 north discussion, which was a 12-mile extension and 1 station up to Deland. So, and the freight traffic that we have on this corridor is really a combination of multi-level auto trains, merchandise trains, coal and rock unit trains, and switching operations. So it is pretty busy during the evening, and because we control dispatch, we're able to also work with CSX when they need some help. If the train happens to show up late and it happens to be outside of our peak, we can usually accommodate depending where it's going and let them into the corridor. Or if they have local train traffic that needs to make a delivery, for some reason, our dispatch looks at what's out on what the traffic levels are, and they can, again, they work closely with CSX to make sure that they're successful in their operation as well. And the same with Amtrak. Again, most of the time, trains do show up off schedule, and they have to find ways to make sure that they can maintain their service. And that's critical to working with all the parties. In Amtrak, it has the 2 round trips, as I mentioned, one down and back from Miami and down and back to Tampa, and then the Sanford Lorton train. Next slide. So this is where I was going to hand this over to Mr. Heffinger to take on the remainder of the discussion on the current day operation.
All right. Thank you, George. One thing I'd like to say starting off is that, working with George and Fred Wise and Brad, you've got about 110, 120 years of experience between those 3 guys. And it's just really, I'd like to think that in my 30 years, I've worked with a lot of experts through DOT and outside of DOT, but I can really say I'm proud to work with these guys. They truly are the experts in their field. And we'll talk a little bit about the emergencies and indemnification. Essentially right now, the owner, which is us, the department, we maintain a $295 million liability insurance, which is kind of like the requirement of our agreements, and it's the industry standard. I can tell you that the industry standard has changed, and they've recently said that 322 million is the new standard. So we're actually in the process of acquiring additional funding for our insurance. And a lot of that funding goes to the part of with CSX and Amtrak and with SunRail. And I can say that CSX and Amtrak are indemnified for loss, damage, destruction of property, or death to a person on state property, unless it's deemed that they were ultimately responsible, like that they derailed, or if it was something kind of a very, something they did that was extremely wrong and caused a serious incident or anything like that. We do have to deal with trespass a lot. essentially anybody that comes in our corridor, we deem that to be a trespasser. It's unfortunate that we have a lot of pedestrian and vehicular collisions. It's amazing that people are in such a hurry, and think that they can win that battle against a train coming at them at 79 mile an hour. And as we all know, that doesn't work out very well for the vehicle. One of the things is we have a lot of we put up a lot of fence. We have a lot of surveys. We've actually applied for a lot of grants that works with our local police and sheriff forces to actually try to actively enforce when somebody's on a corridor, to actually pay them to have off-duty officers to actually enforce in the spots that we've identified where we have a lot of active pedestrian trespassers. One of the first things that happened to me when I first came to SunRail was that 2 weeks into it, we had a major hurricane that come through, and I can tell you that it is a monumental task. You've got a lot of freight, especially that's coming in with regards to working, supplying chlorine to water plants, supplying coal to power plants. And one thing that's really big is that we have 2 large hospitals in Orlando, and we have to get certain things to them with the chlorine gas and things like that. So we have to coordinate with the freight, and we do allow them to run late, in the evening, and we allow them to try to get on early on our corridor. One of the things we have to consider is that, we have to take down all of our gates, and that's to secure those, the shorter gates along 122 crossings that was mentioned before. And that's not an easy task. And essentially, when you take that down, all train traffic is essentially ceased, and all the freight and has to go around like on the A line and things like that. So, and it also takes a while to get that back up. We've actually got it down pretty good. We can shore up our facilities in about 18 hours, and we can bring them back online in about 15 hours. So we've gotten really good at that. But to do that, it takes a day of sunshine when a hurricane's coming. And, the people are kind of fussing at us for closing down the SunRail, but, it takes a while to get there. And then the hurricane comes, it takes a while to get back. So we have to be really careful and really keep a lot of the freight, a lot of the train traffic, and a lot of our citizens that use these things for jobs travel to work with. Next slide, please. One of the things that I believe is very important that I think was a positive in my career before I come to SunRail was the ability to have a positive working relationships and professional relationships with your partners. And we do consider the tenant railroads our partners, with regards to CSX and Amtrak. And one of the things that, George alluded to a little earlier is that every now and then they'll have a little late traffic. And one of the things that we learned from Tri-Rail experience was the fact that the majority of our corridor, almost like 95% of it, is double track. We have a lot of crossovers, which allows us to actually route different trains at different times and move them around. So we do work with CSX when they have an important delivery, with regards to allowing them to come onto our corridor outside of their normal working hours. That's the exception. It's not the rule. And if right now they haven't abused that, neither of the groups. So we work actively with them to kind of work with them to bring them onto our corridor when needed. So I think it's really good for us to have a positive relationship with and put a face to a name with regards to our tenant railroads. Next slide, please. In general, I think our daily operations report's about a 50-page report. It pretty much summarizes everything that happens on our corridor. It alludes every station, every train, how many people get on, how many people get off. It actually talks about how many miles that our freight traffic trains run, how many cars, how many car miles that were run on our freight at the Amtrak, whether they were late or early. And one of the big things that we really preach is, Fred was talking about a on-time percentage of 80%, and they moved up to 90%. And if you're a commuter and you're using a train to get to work, and 90% of the time you're on time, that means you're late at least one day every 2 weeks. So one of the things that we put into our operations and maintenance contract with Bombardier, we had an on-time percentage incentive and if they meet a certain percentage, it's based on up to a 5% of their monthly operating expense as an incentive to maintain an on-time percentage. I can proudly say that, over the last couple of months prior to, and even prior to the COVID issue, which drastically reduced our service to about probably 30% of its original amount. We were at around 6,500 to 7,000. Now we're inching up to around 22 or 2,300 for the daily passenger. But I can say that we maintain our on-time percentage of 99.7% is our average. And a lot of times, you really can't put that into perspective until you try to drop it down into simple things. And what that means is normally it takes about an hour and 22 minutes to go from our northern station, which is DeBary, down to our Poinciana station. And that's roughly around 49 miles. It takes an hour and 22 minutes. And at a 99.7% on-time percentage, that means if you left DeBary, you can almost guarantee within 99.7% of the time that you're going to arrive 49 miles away in Poinciana, plus or minus 15 seconds. And so when you think that you're going to pull into a train traffic, you're going to get to work plus or minus 15 seconds, it gives you a lot of faith in our system and encourages people to ride. And I think at this point, I want to turn it over to Brad to kind of wrap us up. Brad, next slide, please.
Thanks, Hef. And Michael, I know we're running a little behind. I'm fine to run a little bit late. I'll run through these pretty quick because I think, I want to leave a little bit of opportunity for folks to ask questions. These last three slides really represent sort of the catch-all from our experts you've heard from. But some of the things to think about as we go forward is this idea of making sure that as we look to the future, movements are, we have areas that are simply they're either mega regions or super regions. They're not just regional. Trips are regional. Trips are between cities, and we need to think of the context of the whole system, and then also looking at opportunities for development around them. SunRail has done a great job in promoting TOD, and we've seen they really transform corridors. As we look forward, going forward, we know that the way people travel is changing. Some of these areas, as I mentioned, like South Florida and Central Florida, they're not only regional in nature, but they're constrained from transportation options. They want more options, and simply expanding our road networks is just not going to be the answer going forward. And so they're looking for different solutions. The Miami Smart Plan, for example, has 6 different high premium transit improvements, including commuter rail. We're also seeing changes in the way people access new mobility solutions, and it's really important that all of these things are integrated. And so, as we think these things like rideshare and micromobility, and we think about intercity rail and commuter rail, we need to make sure that we're integrating those solutions through technologies, through payment applications, things like that. Next slide, please. As we look forward, Hef mentioned our ridership's was up. We've got the COVID hit. Everybody's got. We're trying to recover from that, but we're starting to see some bright spots there. We're continuing to make investments on the capital side, and as Fred mentioned, that capacity piece is really important, as is the reliability side that Hef mentioned, and so we really need to have a focus on the customer, thinking about what their needs are. Commuter rail tends to be, less frequent service, but some more and more probably need to start thinking about treating it more like a light rail or type service that's going to have more frequency and a late night service, and kind of making sure that we're thinking with the customer's needs. And then, focus on safety and security is a top priority. So thinking beyond just the commuter rail, intercity rail is sort of sexy and everything, but it's that little stuff. That's that reliability, it's the safety, security, ease of payment, all those things that are going to make the difference in attracting and training riders. And then, building on partnerships, obviously. Next slide, please. and just sort of, from a lessons learned standpoint, as I mentioned, you really got to think about the system approach, integrating with other transit options and mobility options, and that world's changing. So you think about those things, and then obviously the ownership and control of the corridor. We've demonstrated some of the real values there. I mean, the ability to control dispatch and ensure reliable service, and just kind of having control of your own destiny a little bit. And then, really digging in the detail of those operating agreements are critical. And obviously, we've got some that can be used as a template to the extent needed. And then I think it almost goes without saying, anything we do is in partnership with our federal partners, either FRA or FTA. Those funding, we're always looking for other funding opportunities. Full funding grant agreements obviously come with certain limitations and requirements. And sometimes that, SunRail is a good example where, we were the grantee, so we own the continuing use requirements, even though we're going to hand it off to the locals. So, there's some complexities and some interesting issues that come up because of that, but kind of think through those things. And then obviously we live in a world of disruption, and so we all live within the reality of political changes, but it seems like more and more our best laid plans are disrupted by changes in the way people move, the way development happens, and then disruptive technologies and so forth. So building resilient systems and resilient organizations is going to be important going forward. So those are that really is it for us, and wanted to kind of we'll stay on here if you got questions.
Brad, we hadn't asked for questions in advance because we thought this might, with the number of speakers, take a fair amount of our time. Would you be amenable? This is probably not fair to ask in this public forum, but would you be amenable to having people submit questions to us by email, and we could forward them to you?
Sure. There are a couple questions in the box.
It looks like a couple. It looks like a couple are coming in.
Yeah, that's fine. We can give you some information on the ridership and the costs. It's a new system on SunRail, and as you'll see with Tri-Rail, the world it's evolved and it takes a little bit of time. Unfortunately, we were really seeing some great progress before COVID, but we're also spending a lot of money on the front end, putting this system in the highest state of good repair possible before we hand over to our partners at the local level. So I think it'll be a little bit of time before you can kind of put your finger on, the cost, how well it's performing from a cost standpoint. And I think you also have to think about the development that's being catalyzed by it as well.
Right, sure. Danny, do you have some questions on chat for us that you've received?
Yeah, the one of the questions was the $432 million that you spent, I believe it was in Central Florida. How was that investment funded? What was the breakdown?
I don't know, Fred may be able to elaborate on that a little bit, but basically there were investments made by CSX in terms of improvement on their freight corridors. So there were things as high up as into Jacksonville in terms of port access, things like that. But Winter Haven improvements to their Winter Haven facility. We also on the state side, we do support investments that support the diversion of freight rail to corridors other than those passenger rail corridors. So we do have projects that primarily grade separation type things. Fred, do you have any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Brad. And actually, the department tracked those investments over a 5-year period and ensured that that CSX did invest the total $500 million in rail improvements in the state of Florida. And a lot of it was port access. It was the development of their intermodal logistics center in South Florida. It was signal system enhancements and other capacity projects all over the state.
I think we have another question that's come in. But Danny, you'll have to read these. I'm on my cell phone. I'm not reading the whole question.
What are FDOT's plans to look at commuter rail in Southwest Florida, Tampa, Sarasota, Naples, along the US 41 corridor, and needs from Jacksonville to points on CSX North?
That's a good question. So there have been some commuter rail studies that have been initiated in Tampa and in Jacksonville. But the Tampa one is not, I think that one runs, don't know if that's 41. It's not Southwest. It's from downtown north. And then and on a CSX line. And then the Jacksonville one that's being studied is from downtown Jacksonville to St. Augustine on the FEC corridor. But those are happening at the local level right now.
Okay.
So our local, like JTA studying the Jacksonville one, and then kind of Hart, T-Barta, and the locals are trying to figure out what their priorities are in the Tampa area.
Danny, any more?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
So will there be some continuing state support considered? The benefits often extend beyond the immediate service areas. How does your state fund some of these passenger rail projects?
I think that's well, we can tell you how we've done it, and I don't know if that's necessarily the model going forward. Tri-Rail was sort of a unique one because it was part of an MOT project, and so it ended up the way it was structured. Basically, we're providing funding for O&M every year. Now there's some local and federal funds, but we're the biggest contributor there. And actually, it's in statute what we have to provide. There's some talk of local support and additional revenues, but there's really no hammer to get that. So we're sort of in that place for a while there. The Central Florida one is that I think Fred mentioned the 7-year operating assistance that we're providing. Now, technically that was supposed to end this year. Because we took a little extra, we had some challenges on that phase 2 north getting it done. We're going to end up going a little bit longer. I think we're going to end up into 23 and or mid 24, I guess. And so we'll be supporting them a little longer than we had originally planned. But then again, we're not sure that like that 7-year operating support is necessarily the path that we want going forward. And that's a conversation as we think about our future of passenger rail in the state. What's the right place for the state to be? And as I mentioned, we're actually investing even beyond the O&M in terms of supporting diversion of freight traffic off of those corridors. So our support is not just the O&M side.
Meredith, we have several other questions, but I think given that it's 11:45, we may send them to Brad and the team and have them answer it and send it out to the participants of the webinar.
Okay, all right. Thank you so much, Brad, Fred, George, and Hef. And Danny, thank you. And Virginians for High-Speed Rail for providing hosting for this webinar today. Since we actually found that in trying to host it, we didn't quite have the chops to do it. So in terms of our technological experience. So we really appreciate your help on this. And of course, Danny, for those of you who don't know us, Danny is actually a member of the board of directors for Virginians for high-speed rail and also of our executive committee. Before we leave, Brad and your company there and friends in VDOT, Florida DOT, that is, I just received an email from Virginia's Director of Rail Programs with the Virginia Department of Public Transportation, who regrets that he had to leave the call. He had to leave the webinar at 11:30 to join a call with States for Passenger Rail. But he says, what a wonderful presentation by Florida, and so incredibly relevant to what Virginia is currently undertaking. I know we followed their model in many instances, and it was informative to hear some of their experiences in implementation. So I think we've accomplished a great deal today, and a great deal of interchange of information and idea and experience. And thank you so much for all of your participation.
Thanks, Meredith. We enjoyed the collaboration, and look forward to future conversations.
All right, goodbye, and goodbye, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar. There will be a video of this webinar coming through. You'll find it in an email that I'll be sending out. So you'll be able to review all this information at your leisure. So thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks.